I'm audible and visible. Thank you for that lovely invite, and thank you for having me, Pallav, Amit, the entire Sapient family. Lovely to be here. I have no idea why you want to listen to a professor in times like this. My job is to give armchair gyan. I don't have to do the hard job of managing the stuff that you're managing. But take it. You want to listen to me, you can listen to me. So, I hope you're all keeping safe in these very, very tough times. Amit sir very kindly gave a few quotes of my past words. When you're a commentator, you're relying on the poor memory of everybody else because you often make a lot of wrong statements. So what you're hoping for and praying for is that the statements, only the right statements are remembered by the people. But, what I'll try and cover today is the following. Let me start off by saying that there seems to be a big divergence between what's happening in the economy and what's happening in the markets, not just for India, it's happening across the world. So, economists should stop pretending that we know where the markets are going. The market folk should stop pretending that they are, leading indicators for where the economy is going. The two are going absolutely differently. I'll try and wear two different hats and try and cover both. It might be right, it might be wrong. By the way, if what I say turns out to be right, please remember me. If what I say turns out to be wrong, this conversation never happened. What I'll try and cover is the following. I'll try and cover a glimpse of the Indian economy before COVID-19. What was the situation like? Through COVID-19, what is happening to our economy, right? And therefore, after we come out of COVID-19, what is the path ahead of us? How will things unfold? How can things unfold? What should be done? What could be done, etc. Having covered all of that, we will then try and look at what's happening in relation to markets. Equity markets, bond markets, currency markets, and so on and so forth. Now, few things very quickly. I'm not going to talk too much about COVID because I'm not a virologist. I have no idea how this is going to pan out. I can only hope and pray that we get not very soon. But the overarching theme is we are still going through a pandemic. So it is extremely difficult to to look at the economy or to look at markets when you're going through the glimpse of what is going to be an extremely tough situation, and it already is and will continue to be a tough situation for many of us. So let's start with the state of the economy before COVID-19. The problem is the economy was already in a soft spot even before COVID-19 hit us. People often compare and say, this is like, maybe after the global financial crisis. It's not. Before the global financial crisis, India was in a better economic shape. Global financial crisis did not hit us directly. In this case, even before COVID-19, we were in a weak shape, and COVID-19 is hitting us in a big, big way directly. It's not an indirect through America or something. It's to us directly, right? So what was the shape of the economy before COVID-19, and why was it weak? And when I say it's weak, what do I mean by that? 3 or 4 areas. Let's start with the first one, which Amit mentioned, the health of the financial services ecosystem. Right? As of September 2019, the official non-performing assets of banks was 9.3% of advances. Okay, I think that number came down to about 8.5% of advances in March. But by that time, there were forbearances and moratorium already in place. So we can't really see what the number is. So 9.3% as of September 2019. Unfortunately, that's not the right number. Why is that not the right number? Because there's already forbearance given to MSME. There is some forbearance given to commercial real estate as well. And in the case of NBFCs, the classification, the loans to NBFCs, the classification was not perfect. So instead of 9.3%, the real number is probably closer to 11 to 12% for the banking system, which by the way is not too bad. 9.3 going to 11, 12 is not the end of the world. Bigger problem was in the NBFC sector. In the NBFC sector, as of September, the official non-performing assets was 6.3% of advances. Now, my daughter who does biology, she will tell you that number is wrong. If banks are at 11 to 12%, there is no way NBFCs can be at 6.3%. The real number has to be at least 11 to 12%. NBFCs have not gone through an asset quality review the way banks have gone. So which means that there are a lot of problems which are due to come out at some stage. By the way, I'm not saying all NBFCs are bad, all banks are bad. That is, you all know that's not true. There are very good banks, very good NBFCs, but the ecosystem as a whole already was at 11 to 12% NPAs. It's not a good situation to be in. When you are sitting with 11 to 12% NPAs, as a financial services system, you are in no position to lend. You're worried about what's happening to your NPAs, and you're worried about what could happen to you. And if you're a public sector banker, you're worried about going to jail. So you're not really worried about trying to lend more. You're in no position to lend more. And if banks don't lend, growth cannot happen. I mean, our country needs credit growth to happen for the economy as a whole to grow. Our loans are barely 50% of GDP. This is from banking loans to the private sector, right? The same number for China is over 200% of GDP. Okay, there is a zameen asman ka farak between us and China in terms of that credit growth, and that credit growth is a critical component required for eventual growth as well. So our financial services system was very, very weak and in no position to fund our immense growth potential. Second, related to the first part, several other sectors, we have simply been kicking the can down the road. The sectors are in chronic stresses: power sector, real estate sector, telecom sector, airline and shipping, several parts of MSME. They're all under chronic stresses. Power is a great example. A lot of power producers are producing at extremely high cost. Distribution companies, which are all owned by state governments, many of them are more than bankrupt. They're actually borrowing money just to pay the power producers. In fact, at the end of this fiscal year, the debt of all the DISCOMs put together will be at record levels. So we are essentially borrowing money just to pay our bills at this point in time, and somebody has to pick up the bill eventually. Likewise, telecom, you know the story of telecom better than I do. Real estate, again, we are kicking the can down the road, pretending there is no problem when everybody knows there's a problem. Several of these sectors are under chronic stresses. We are not cleaning it up. We are just continuing and hoping and praying it will remain, somehow it will go away like a bad dream. Third and biggest problem, and this is in fact not just for the last 5 years, 10 years, it's a problem for the last 20 years. We have not been able to create jobs and output, particularly jobs. Okay, our biggest strength, you ask anybody, any Indian, we will tell you that our biggest strength is our people, right? Our people, we have smart people, we have aspirational people, we have young people, they all want to do great things. But if you see some of the statistics around our demographics, they are shocking. Okay, of course, good progress has happened over the last 70 years or whatever since independence, 73 years. But there is a lot of areas still for improvement. Okay, first statistic, of the total GDP which the CSO measures, only 17% is contributed by women. And that number, by the way, is a comparable number to what comes out of the Middle East. Okay, so we are no better than the Middle East countries in terms of percentage of women contribution to GDP. Likewise, the worker participation rate is barely 35-36%. A young country like us, a lot of us should be working, either studying or working. The actual number of people working is far lower than what it ought to be. Third, you all know this, depending on whom you look at for the statistics, between 44 to 50% of our workforce is still in agriculture, which contributes barely 15% of our GDP. Why are so many people in agriculture? Not because they love it. Nobody loves it. Very few people love it. They are there because there are simply no other jobs. Over the years, we have struggled. We have really struggled to create jobs and output. We missed the manufacturing bus completely. So much so that now we are saying, "Ho to hoga hi nahi." It is impossible. We will not get the manufacturing bus. And I'll come back to tell you why it's absolutely not true. We can get the manufacturing bus even now. But anyway, we missed the manufacturing bus, because of which everything up there, you go to the Siddhivinayak temple and buy a Ganesh Murti that's made outside of India. You go to any 4-star, 5-star hotel, you see the fittings around you, 50% of the fittings are imported. Okay. And it's not just imports of gold and oil. It is imports of electronics, of plastics, of chemicals, of fertilizers, intermediaries of all kinds. Everything is imported. Instead of making it ourselves, we are getting it from China, from Taiwan, from Thailand, from all over the place, right? So we are essentially been exporting jobs and importing goods and services for a long, long time. And we are not creating jobs ever, okay? So that's our third and biggest problem. Why is that the case? Why are we not able to create jobs and output? What it feels like, and people like Manish Sabharwal speak about this very nicely, there is regulatory cholesterol. Try acquiring land to set up a factory. Try running a factory of 1,000 people. Try going through the legal system if you have to do contract enforcement. Our governments, successive governments across various political hues, they keep changing the policy every day, come with retrospective taxes, etc. It's a nightmare to do business in India, even now, right? So even though people are moving supply chains out of India, we are not in the top of the list in terms of alternative destinations. It's still Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, even though they are much smaller places, we are still struggling to get out there as the first country of choice to be for investment purposes. Ease of investments is very, very bad. The fourth problem, besides banks, sectors, and our chronic inability to create jobs and output, fourth problem, we often give galis to the government saying you're not spending enough. तुम बहुत कम spend कर रहे हो, you're too fiscally prudent, you listen to the guys outside, you don't spend enough. Actually, that's not true. The last 3-4 years, the government has been spending a lot of money. So the actual fiscal deficit, which is the difference between what the government spends and what the government collects, is much higher than what the official numbers suggest. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. The official number for FY18 or FY19 actually was supposed to be 5.9% of GDP, center plus state put together. The real number was closer to 10% of GDP if you include the public sector enterprises as well. So, significantly higher. Last year, again, that number was 11 to 12% of GDP was the actual fiscal deficit. If the government had not been spending last year, our GDP growth would not have been 4.2%. It would have been far, far lower than that. Okay. So actually, they've been spending a lot of money. Unfortunately, that also comes at a cost, because if you're spending so much of money and not creating jobs and output, somebody has to pay the bill eventually. We are essentially borrowing money from our children's future to pay for our current expenses right now, which is what everybody's doing, both the government as well as all of us in the private sector as well. So 4 big problems: health of the financial services ecosystem, several sectors not in good shape, the inability to create jobs and output, and the fact that over time we have been spending money to try and adjust for all of this. Okay. By the way, I promise you there is a something like a happy ending to the story. Okay, it's not all gloom and doom. There are ways in which we can come out, and some good things are happening. Okay, so now comes COVID-19. What is happening through COVID-19? COVID-19 is a disaster. Okay, we can't do anything about it. It's come to us 1 in 100 years. Unfortunately, we are the generation which has to live through it. It's a complete disaster. Our economy was closed for a big, significant chunk of time. Even now, it's operating only at 90% of capacity. We are not yet at 100%. The cases are still going up. Hopefully, I pray that it comes down pretty soon. Maybe by October, November end, the cases will plateau and start coming down. We're all hoping for that. But until then, the economy is not operating at full capacity, and there is fear. We are not going out and spending money. All our discretionary spending has completely come down, which means the GDP is taking a huge knock. Now, for a long time, we've been saying, Mean Observatory Group, we've been saying that we will see double-digit contraction of GDP this year. It was obvious right from May, June that we will see a double-digit contraction. Now, all the official estimates are also coming out as double-digit contraction. Goldman Sachs has come and said minus 14.8% of GDP for this year. Okay. Now, there are multiple ways of looking at it. One is, it's take care, even if it's 15% contraction of GDP, it's done and dusted. Now, question is, how do we recover from here? What do we do beyond this, right? Which is a fair question to ask. Recovery is far more important than just a number of the past. Okay. But we cannot ignore the fact that such a sharp contraction is going to give us a body blow. We're going to get beaten up as businesses, as a workforce, at the government with all of its tax finances coming down. All of us are taking a beating. There's no questions asked. Okay. So remember, we are already a weak economy, and now we are taking a body blow through COVID-19, where growth will be minus 14-15% maybe for this fiscal year. It might come back the next year, but it will still be a long, long haul and a struggle. Okay. So what is the impact of this negative GDP growth, besides, of course, the medical problem, etc.? There is distress amongst people. There is distress amongst businesses. Now, here is the good news, or a partial good news. The distress amongst people, to some extent, is being handled. Okay. Initially, it wasn't being handled well. So in the beginning of April, we all saw those, heart-rending scenes of migrant workers walking back and all of that, which was terrible. But thereafter, all governments, local governments, state governments, central government, they all actually got their act together. In terms of giving relief to people, NREGA has been activated. Actually, the spending in NREGA now is almost close to the full year number for last year. It's been spent as of now. So that was done. Likewise, the other schemes, this Gramin Kalyan Yojana, this Jan Dhan Yojana accounts giving some money. Food Corporation of India has bought a lot of food grains from farmers. That's done two things. One is it's put money in the hands of farmers. Second, it's actually given a lot of food. The Food Corporation of India as of June was sitting on 97 million tons of food grains, all-time high record. Okay, which is the reason the Prime Minister could say, until November, I'll give everybody 5 kgs of rice and 1 kg of pulses, because there is record level of food grains. So at least food security is there. Now some people say, no, food is not going to everybody. Actually, if you go to the rural areas, by and large, people are getting it. Okay, so it's working. That PDS system is working. So in terms of at least giving money in the hands of the bottom of the pyramid, something is going through. Yes, Narega is far lower than what people could have earned in the cities, but at least something is going through. Food security is there, and money is genuinely going towards the rural sector. Okay. On top of it, monsoons have been good. So the spatial distribution of rainfall plus the overall number plus 7% or so when I last checked, it's good. We should be seeing 3 to 5% of growth in agriculture this year. All told, in fact, rural sector is doing reasonably well. Remember, they were not impacted by COVID-19 as much. It's only now that rural sector is being impacted. So even outside of agriculture, other sectors were doing well as well in the rural sector, industry as well as services. Plus they've got money through Narega, plus this Food Corporation of India money has come through. And there is other schemes of local, state and central governments which have poured money into the rural sector. So rural sector is looking reasonably good. It's going through some trouble now because of COVID-19, but hopefully it will get controlled there faster, because after all, the population density is much lower in the rural sectors. Okay. So people side is reasonably okay. We could all ask for more. I think other countries are given a lot more, but we have our constraints, so that's okay. The real pain is for businesses. So businesses have not got any money. You can argue that, yes, we've given 3 lakh crores or at least announced 3 lakh crores of credit guaranteed by the central government to MSMEs, etc. See, giving loans when you don't have sales and when you don't have bottom line, loans don't really help. And, I'm also part of Dwara Research and other research agencies. All the research I have seen indicates there is deep distress amongst MSMEs across sectors, right? So there are some numbers which suggest that between 30 to 40% of MSMEs might actually face existential trouble over the next few weeks and months. I mean, they might not survive. And that's a terrible predicament, right? There are 63 million or 6.3 crore MSMEs. If 30% of them are in deep trouble, that's bad news for us as an economy as a whole. So businesses are in real deep trouble. The organized business, not so much, particularly in the right sectors, but the MSMEs are in deep, deep trouble, and they employ a lot of people, right? Because of this trouble amongst employed people as well as MSMEs, you would have seen the CMI report on the employment data as well. And amongst the MSMEs, the stresses in the banking system are going to go up. Now, we don't know what the real numbers will look like, right? Because there is still moratorium going on. The June results did not reveal the real state of how much of moratorium has come through. Only a few banks gave very granular details, others did not. So we don't know what the numbers can look like. But some of the simulations I have seen, based on the stresses in various sectors, like in construction, real estate, various kind of like hospitality, tourism, aviation, multiple sectors which have been impacted, and in MSMEs and in retail. Retail numbers are not looking good at all. They're looking pretty scary. All put together, one estimate shows that the real non-performing assets of banks and NBFCs could go as high as 18 to 20% of advances. Remember, they were already probably 11 to 12% before COVID-19. That might well become 18 to 20% of advances. That's a disaster of a number. Okay, see, the system will survive. It will not collapse. It's not as if disaster matlab it will all collapse. No, it will not collapse. India will not collapse. But it just sets us back in our ability to grow from here. If you let it remain as it is, our potential growth just comes down because the ability of the banking system to lend goes away. So huge stresses building up in the financial sector. It is in no shape to fund our growth going forward. Last bit, fiscal deficit. We have no choice. We have to spend at a time like this because there is distress. You have to take care. It's almost like a war-like situation. By the way, on the border also, the things are not looking great. So we will go through a fiscal pain here. And remember, because your GDP is contracting, your tax collections have collapsed. there is no direct tax, there's no indirect tax collections or very little indirect tax collections. All of this is going to hit the fiscal deficit. So that fiscal deficit number across center and states could cross a record 15% of GDP. Now, most analysts will tell you 12%, 13%. I think it will be higher than 15% of GDP. Okay. Again, it's a disastrous number. The total debt to GDP for center and states and the governments put together could cross 90% of GDP, all put together. Now, so the total situation is as follows: double-digit contraction in growth. You have severe hit to businesses and people. People are probably better, or okay, at least can manage. Rural sector is actually okay. It's not in a bad shape. Businesses are in very, very bad shape. Financial sector, banks and NBFCs put together are going to take a big knock. We will not know the full numbers until June of next year when the restructuring is over. And our fiscal deficit is going to be an extremely high number. Now, I promised you there is a good end to the story. What happens in the future? How can we go on from here? I hope I'm audible. Is it okay? Somebody tell me if it's okay, please.
Yeah.
That's fine, sir. We can hear you.
Okay, great. So I just saw a comment saying no audio.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens going forward from here, right? And how do we get out of this? So the first, let's take a look at what can we do right now to actually get us out of this rut, right? First, we have to assume that COVID-19 will get over at some time. Hopefully a vaccine will come, or we will all get herd immunity. Just as Dharavi has settled down, maybe we will all settle down and we will all move on. Let's hope and pray that happens fast. But once that is behind us and that the impact of COVID-19 is behind us, what do we do then? One big question which is being raised repeatedly is, should money be put in the hands of people? This is a demand problem. There is not enough demand. If you put money in the hands of people, people will start buying. And once people start buying, then our capacity utilization is very low. So our factories will start operating. That will create jobs, that will create output, and therefore everything will become a nice, happy family. In theory, that's absolutely fine. Okay. In theory, that's absolutely fine. Where we've kind of slipped up in the past is, yes, we can create demand by putting money in people's hands. But that demand which is coming up has to be met by our own supply, which means as much as our demand goes up, we have to make sure we are producing a similar amount of at least that much, if not more, so that inflation doesn't come and we don't start increasing our imports. Okay. What has happened to us in the past? If you look at the period between 2005 and 2012, money was growing in a big, big way in the hands of people. Okay. How do we define money? It's currency in circulation and it's deposits with banks. That's the money that you and I own, that we can actually go out and spend. So the higher the amount of money, the more economic activity can ensue. So between 2005 and 2012, the amount of money in the system kept going up. Okay. Now, despite that money going up, and by the way, demand also went up, two things happened over time. One, inflation came in because we were not. So if you remember, the food inflation went up quite sharply at that point in time. Food inflation, particularly in pulses, in proteins, in milk, in eggs, all that went up through the roof because there was not enough supply, too much money chasing too little goods. Second thing which happened was all the demand which was coming from people with money was being met by imports. Oil, gold, electronics, chemicals, fertilizers, plastics, all kind of intermediaries, everything was being imported. So we were creating domestic money, all of which was going towards limited goods or going towards imports. It was not going towards job creation and for domestic output. So, my biggest contention is, yes, we need domestic demand, but domestic demand without domestic output is useless. In fact, it is toxic because eventually you will end up with inflation or a currency problem. Today, there is no problem on currency. In fact, we have a reverse problem, too much money coming in. But eventually, when our demand starts to pick up, we will end up in the same place unless we can create domestic jobs and output. Eventually, that is the bottom line. We have to be able to create domestic jobs and output. That output should be more than what we demand, which means we should be hopefully doing net exports. Even if we can't do net exports, at least produce as much as you're demanding. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Okay. Now, so two questions. How do we create money? Second, how do we ensure the demand which is created by that money goes towards creation of output and jobs in the country? Which means how do you ensure that output matches the demand? Creation of money happens through three routes. Okay. The first route is when banks lend money. When banks lend money to you and me, they create deposits. That deposit is money. Okay. This is the cleanest way of creating money. By the way, banks create money. So banks lending money. Why did I say that credit growth is important for the country's growth? When credit growth happens, money is created. Hopefully that credit is also setting up a factory, setting up supplies, etc. So you have demand and supply coming in together over time. Okay. So that's the first route. Second route is when foreign currency comes in. When net foreign currency comes in, our deposits grow and money is created. Third route is when the government spends money using a fiscal deficit, which means government borrows money from RBI or from banks and spends it, then our money goes up. Okay. So all three routes are available for creation of money. At the moment, the pressure is on the government to create the money. Why is that the case? Because banks are in no position to lend. Currency inflows are coming in, but that's not enough. We need more money creation. So therefore, maybe the government should spend a lot of money. I just gave you Gyan saying the fiscal deficit is going very high, but the point being made is let the fiscal deficit go high, no problem, we can do it. Okay. That is the easier part, creation of money. The bigger part is how do we ensure that the demand is met by local output, right? Which is where we have failed for 20 years. It's not a 5-year, 10-year problem. It's a 20-year problem. We've not created domestic jobs. So the ultimate bottom line is we have to make it easy to create jobs and output inside this country. Okay. How do we do that? I think we need 4 things. First thing, we have to clean up our banking sector. We cannot live with as I said, it is not as if the country will collapse if we don't do these things. We will survive. As India, we are a strong country. We will always survive. But we will stilt our growth. We will not achieve our potential. We will be far from our potential. First thing, clean up the banks. How do you clean up the banks? 18 to 20% NPAs is a gigantic number. You have to create something like a bad bank, put all the bad loans there. Then you have to do deep banking reforms, governance reforms, and market reforms. What does this mean? Banking reforms is simple. Get babus and netas out of banking. Why do you have so much of NPAs in banking, particularly in PSU banking? Because you had telephone banking 12 years ago, then you had mudra banking, then you had shamiana banking, then you have, moment babus and netas get involved in banking, you are, even with the best of intentions, you're doing all the right thing, infrastructure, MSME, all the right things. But let the professional bankers do their job. Don't have bureaucrats and netas run day-to-day banking. That's the biggest reform required for banks. Okay. Second is governance reforms. By the way, governance issues are there everywhere. Private sector banks, foreign banks, public sector banks. It is not as if it is limited to only one set of banks. Okay. So what do you need to do out there? Cleaning up of auditors, cleaning up of rating agencies, cleaning up of board of directors, cleaning up of RBI. Why is it not able to find out all these issues when they come up on time? Okay. So a lot of governance reforms required. Third is market reforms. You need a deeper secondary market liquidity for corporate bonds, for loans. You need derivatives, whole bunch of things. So all this cleanup of banks has to happen. It is important for us to achieve our growth that the banking system be capable of creating good quality money. Second, all the other sectors I mentioned to you, power sector, real estate sector, telecom sector, airline and shipping, MSMEs, you have to clean them. You cannot kick the can down the road. Power sector, by the way, you probably have to increase tariffs. You probably have to privatize the discoms. Okay, you cannot run discoms the way they're being run right now. But there was a problem, by the way, in the steel sector during Vajpayee's time. You know what happened that time? This is a story, apocryphal story. All the stakeholders, bankers, babus, industrialists, everybody was put inside a room and the room was locked. The key was thrown away. They were told the room will be broken open only when you come out with a solution. Until then, don't even bang the door. We will not open the door. Similar stuff is required for our power sector. Get the power ministry, the states, the center, the discoms, the power producers into one place. Hammer a solution out. Don't kick the can down the road by borrowing money, etc. Come out with what needs to be done, clean it up, move on in life. Similarly with real estate. एक धक्का खाना पड़ेगा रियल एस्टेट में, खा लो, it's better, हजम हो जाएगा, then we can move on. Okay, so sectoral cleanup is the second part. Third, extremely critical part, we have to make it easy for both for people like you as well as for overseas investors to create jobs and output in India, which means that if whether it is whether it is Apple and Foxconn who wants to set up a large plant, one more large plant in India, or whether you want to start manufacturing that Ganesh ka Murti in-house rather than us importing it from Thailand or somewhere, you should be willing and running and saying, yes, I can create jobs and output in India. I can acquire land, I can hire people, I can comply with labor laws, no problem, justice can be delivered. It's a boil the ocean set of reforms. It's not easy at all. It's very easy for a professor like me to sit and give this gyan, but we all know it is tough, but it has to be done. We don't have a choice. Unless we do these reforms and make it easy to actually create jobs and output in India rather than importing it from outside, we will never come out of this rut. Okay. The last thing, in fact, there is a very nice paper being done by Dr. Rakesh Mohan. It tells you that one of the big reasons why, despite having a very large workforce in India, we are not able to attract large, people to invest in India for manufacturing. The skills and the quality of our workforce is not enough. Okay, and it's not just about skill education. It's about a whole ecosystem, starting with healthcare, starting with nutrition. 40% of our children are undernourished between the ages of 0 to 5. Okay. So if you're stunted growth at that point in time, your brain is permanently damaged. You're not in a position to go, to aspire for higher education, etc. Right? So healthcare, nutrition, education, those investments, public services, we have to invest as much as we're barely investing some 3% of our GDP on these things. We have to invest a lot more. Okay. And, earlier, I'm fond of saying this. Earlier, apparently, Bhutto used to say, that Pakistani guy used to say that even if you have to eat grass, we'll get a nuclear bomb. I think our mantra should be, even if we have to eat grass, we have to ensure our children have healthcare, education, nutrition. Because this is the best bet we have. This is the best thing we can give them to equip them for a very uncertain future. Who the hell knows what's going to happen in the future? Automation hai, technology hai, ways of doing business are changing. Where will jobs come from? Nobody has a clue. But if you give them these things, they will figure it out. They will know what needs to be done. And that investment, we owe it to them and to ourselves. This can be the best investment for our future. So 4 things: clean up the banks, clean up sectors like power, real estate, telecom, etc. Make it easier to create jobs in India. I mean, it's possible. And people like Rana Day, people like Dr. Pawan Kaushal, all of these guys have written lots of papers on what needs to be done to make ease of investments in India better. Let's follow that. 4th part is investments into care, education, and nutrition as a medium to long-term investment. Now, why is this? Okay, so 2 parts. Therefore, yes, demand has to be excited. You have to either create money through government spending or through credit, etc. But at the same time, supply has to come through, and for that, these real reforms have to happen. The last bit, and then I'll kind of move on. I know I'm running out of time. Why is this not happening? And this is not just a question of this particular government, right? All this gyan, by the way, that I'm giving you, this is nothing new. People have written about this for many years put together. Why is it not happening? I'm still hopeful it can happen. And this is where that hopeful part comes in, okay? Typically, as you all know, through a crisis, we come out and do the right things. I'm still hoping that the right things can happen. I think 3 things are needed, or 3 or 4 things are needed for this to happen, okay? Actually, let's make it just two things. First, what Amit mentioned earlier, we have to acknowledge the truth. The truth is we have a problem, okay? We have high cholesterol, we have high BP, we have all sorts of issues. The good news is all this is solvable. There is no problem in India which is not solvable. And the reason why, what Amit was reading out about what I'd written in the past, I get so frustrated with green shoots hai, sab theek ho jayega, koi tension nahi hai. Arey, kya bakwas kar rahe ho yaar? The reports are staring you in the face. We are in trouble. And the good news is these are solvable issues. Blood pressure and cholesterol is easily solvable. Please control your diet. Please exercise. Sab theek ho jayega, right? This is not a death wish or a terminal illness that we have to hide the report from the patient. Nothing like that. The more you hide, you're creating more problems. Okay. So please acknowledge the truth. It is all solved. Nothing is unsolvable in India. Okay. The second part, to implement changes like this, I gave very easily कि ये करो, वो करो, banking solve करो, power solve करो, ease of doing business solve करो, healthcare कर दो. ये तो बहुत आसान है बोलना. Can you imagine the problem of implementing something like this? It is incredible. This is called third generational reforms, by the way. Economists call it third generational reforms. It is incredibly difficult. It's like boiling the ocean. So for doing something like this, you cannot have a bureaucracy implement changes like this. Bureaucracy is very good for making incremental changes. If everything is going fine and you want incremental changes, great. A prime minister's office is enough. They will do it. For changes like this, you need three things. You need clear political vision on karna kya hai economy mein. Okay, is it big government, small government? Is it socialism? Is it capitalism? Is it foreign capital, domestic capital? You need clarity of thought on what your economic ideology is. Okay. Second, you need empowered technocrats. You need somebody like Nandan Nilankani for Aadhaar. You need somebody like Arundhati Bhattacharya or Uday Kotak for cleaning up the banking system. You need somebody like a Pawan Goenka for ease of doing business. Get empowered technical experts. You have a lot of experts you're listening to right now. It's not enough to listen to them. You have to empower them and allow them to be part of the operations. They have to be running this. 1991, you had people like Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Manmohan Singh who came from outside. They were technocrats. You need technocrats for big changes. Third part we have, which is a competent bureaucracy. You definitely need a good bureaucracy because these are center state, big changes required. You cannot do it unless you have a competent bureaucracy. Unfortunately, right now, everything is being done by bureaucracy. I am not seeing enough of economic vision. I'm not seeing enough of empowered technical experts, technocrats. Okay, I'm hopeful it will come through. There is a lovely political mandate available with the government. There is no chance of them going anywhere right now. Hopefully, they will put together a good team of empowered technocrats, bureaucracy, and people, political people with vision, and then we can do all these changes. Even if we do 50% of the changes, I'm telling you, our growth will be fantastic. We will have our place in the sun. Now, very quickly on markets, and I'm totally out of time. So let's go completely switch directly in from economics to markets. I told you the two are totally different. The biggest thing which kind of puts a wedge between economics and markets is obviously flows. Okay, economics and macroeconomics is useless for markets unless flows come in as well. Now, what's holding up equity markets globally, not just in India, but globally? One, of course, is this money being printed by central banks, et cetera, et cetera. But think of it more fundamentally. If today you have investments in the equity market and you're not comfortable ki boss ye acha nahi lag raha hai, I don't know what the hell is happening in the economy, etc. You sell the equity. What do you do with the money? Do you buy real estate? Do you buy gold? Do you buy foreign currency? Or do you buy fixed income? Fixed income, the normal natural situation, the average fixed deposit rate amongst all banks put together right now is 6%. Post-tax, it's below 4%. The expected inflation is, as per RBI survey, is over 10%. Why would I put money at 4% return? Okay, so it's like the political situation. There is no alternative. If you can't put money at 4% and you don't trust real estate, you can only buy so much of gold and you can only buy so much of foreign currency. You have to put money in equities. So on a post-tax adjusted basis, there is no alternative. So, I was speaking to a good fund manager friend, a large fund manager friend who's very open and honest. And he was actually saying, boss, don't put money in my fund. I don't know what to buy. Right? And he gave me another line. He said, you put money in my fund, you give me enough money, I will drive up the price of coal to the price of diamond. मैं खरीदता जाऊंगा, मुझे क्या देता है? I'm deploying your money. Okay, but that's the real situation, right? So equity markets, yes, we are seeing negative flows in mutual funds for the last 2 months, both in July and August. But clearly, retail money still is going in. Maybe all of us are sitting jobless at home and now starting to do zero dha and trading and buying and selling, and therefore money is still going into equity markets. And that there is no alternative situation is still playing out for a long time. Okay, and this is nothing new. This is also happening globally. It's also been happening in India for the last 6 or 7 years. Very quickly, if I remember the numbers right, 6 years till December 2019, the earnings growth was barely 4% per annum. Only 4. Nifty 50 earnings growth was just 4.1% per annum. Nifty itself grew by 11.6% per annum. Right? So that divergence is there because there is no other place to put the money. On very quickly on bonds and FX, here is the problem with bonds and FX. It is entirely in the hands of RBI today. Okay, so I used to be a trader for about 20 years in FX and bond markets. If the trade is entirely based on what RBI will do, I would rather not trade, because RBI can do random things today and random things tomorrow. There's no point trying to second guess what RBI will do. But if you have to guess, let me guess. So here is the point. Governor Das, I think, is absolutely keen to support the government borrowing program. He's very, very keen to support the economy. He wants to give relief to the people and to the economy. Okay, so left to himself, he will keep rates as low as possible. Okay, he will do, and he's doing it, to be honest, right from the beginning. Ever since he joined December of 2018, tab se he is doing all he can to give liquidity, bring down rates, cut rates, do very innovative things like LTRO, TLTRO, all of that he's done to keep rates low. Where is the constraint? The constraint is what I mentioned earlier. If you create too much money, you're going to create a lot of demand eventually. And that demand, if it is not met by supplies, will create inflation. So when inflation comes in, you have a problem. At the moment, there is inflation, but that's not because of money. It's because of supply side constraints, because there is logistics issues and all that. But eventually, 1 year down the road, with so much money created, and especially money in rural hands, every time money is created in rural hands, I have seen inflation. Don't ask me why it happens, but it happens. Okay, and probably because we don't create enough domestic output. Okay, so if inflation comes in, it becomes a problem. And the way things are looking, I'm very worried about what inflation can look like even 1 year down the road. Aaj ka inflation theek hai, chal jayega. I mean, it's not a demand inflation, it's a supply inflation. But even 1 year down the road, I am afraid with so much of money in the system, unless our output goes up to match the demand, we can create inflation. So personally, while RBI is keeping the rates low, 10-year bond is still at 6%. Actually, it is doing a great disservice to the savers. Right? If it was left to us, the rates would be 8% or higher, right? Because our expected inflation is 10%, right? So it would be much higher. So we are subsidizing the government, allowing the government to borrow at much, much lower. Nobody else is borrowing in 10 years. Only the government is borrowing. Can you think of any industrialist who wants to set up a greenfield project right now? I mean, where is the question of any investment right now? So the only person borrowing is government. We are subsidizing the cost for the government, and inflation is going to eat our wealth away. Okay. Personally, I would have preferred much higher longer end rates, and short end rates should be very low where they are right now, but not my choice. But long story short, I think Governor Das will keep the rates as low as possible, but because inflation is very uncertain, and because the government is borrowing so much, and because I'm not confident that our output will match up with the demand, I'm afraid that rates might go up over time. Okay, it might be kept under control for the time being, but over time it might probably go up. Dollar rupee likewise. Right now there is a lot of flows coming in. Okay, there is forced austerity. We are not buying anything. We're not consuming, and because we're not consuming, there is no imports. There is no oil imports. There's no electronic imports. There's nothing. No imports happening. Because imports have collapsed, our exports minus imports, our total current account deficit will be a positive this year. It will be plus $20 billion. Normally it's a negative, but this time it will be a plus $20 billion positive. If we get FDI even of $30 billion, if we get FPI of, let's say, $15 billion, sab milake, we are looking at $50 to $60 billion of total permanent inflows into the country. That's what RBI is buying right now. Okay. Now, should rupee strengthen, right? And this is a big debate which is doing the rounds. So people say if dollar rupee comes down, which means rupee strengthens, then inflation will come down. But RBI's own model says that for 5% change in dollar rupee, inflation is changed only by 0.2%. There's hardly any change in inflation because of dollar rupee movement. Okay. On the contrary, if dollar rupee comes down, let's say if RBI was not buying today, dollar rupee today would be at 68, not at 73 something, it would be at 68. Okay. At 68, you and I will feel richer. If we convert our rupees into dollars, we'll feel much richer. But it will kill our domestic industry. Remember, we are already importing from outside. Our consumption is anyway being imported, right? Anyway, we export jobs and import goods. We will do more of that if our dollar rupee comes down, right? So personally, I'm not even though it makes me poorer and I have 2 expensive children to educate in the US, even then I'm saying it doesn't make sense for rupee to strengthen too much. After 1 year, we will get back into starting into import a lot more. If at that time we can increase our domestic output, by all means, rupee can strengthen. So everything boils down, in my view, to jobs and output. It's not just demand. Demand creation is easy. Giving money in people's hand is easy. The difficult part for us that we have to solve is how do you create jobs and output, which we have not done for the last 20 years. That is the bottom line. If we can create jobs and output, rupee can strengthen, no problem at all. What will RBI do on FX? While it is making very confusing signals, I think they will not let rupee appreciate beyond a point. See, dollar itself is weakening. So if dollar itself is weakening globally, they will allow rupee to appreciate. But beyond that, I don't think they will allow rupee to outperform the other currencies, which is what they're doing right now. Because too much of rupee appreciation against a yuan, against a euro, etc., is bad news for our own domestic industry. It's bad for our terms of trade. So long story short, equity markets, don't ask me. In fact, I have to ask you guys what the hell to do. But purely from there is no alternative perspective, I think money continues to go in there. Hope and pray that the economy will catch up eventually to make sure that it matches with what the equity expectations are. I think the potential is definitely there, but a lot of hard work needs to be done. FX, I personally don't, both FX and bonds is entirely RBI. Very difficult to guess, but personally, if I was in the RBI, I would say don't let rupee strengthen too much. Let it go in line with what's happening to dollar globally. Too much of appreciation might just be reversed later on, 1 year later, and it will be very bad for our domestic industry. Interest rates for now, I think it will be kept under control. But I am worried about with so much of money being printed, I'm worried about what happens to our inflation 1 year down the road. And therefore, I'm worried about rates going up eventually. Inflation is not a worry for the US, not for Japan, but definitely a worry for us, unfortunately. It hasn't gone away as being a worry. But bottom line for me, it's about our entire success story depends on our ability to create jobs and output, which depends on cleaning up banks, cleaning up sectors like power, real estate, telecom, etc., making it easy to invest and create jobs, land laws, labor laws, capital, contract enforceability, legal processes, policy certainty, etc. And finally, investments in healthcare, education, and nutrition. These are the 4 mantras I think are important. If we get our act together and at least get some of these done, our future is bright. People are saying our potential growth has come down to 5-6%. I think that's nonsense. Our potential growth is still 8, 9, 10%. Just as China managed for 3 decades, we can do it. But these real sector reforms have to happen. Bottom line, don't look for magical solutions in fiscal policy or monetary policy. The solutions lie in the real economy of all those 4 things that I mentioned to you. I've taken too much of time. Amit, back to you, please.
Sir, hi. I think wonderful people would have been listening in stone silence, because what I feel is that noise, when deciphered, can also lead to music which can soothe the nerves. So you have cut the noise and probably led us to music which have actually soothed the nerves. Still, as an advisor, when you say that we need to tell you as to what to do with your money, we also get up in the morning and toss a coin that should we sell or should we buy today. That's the state of the market today, because we are not able to decipher as to what is leading to this rally. One question which I will start and then we'll take questions from the panel is that we were into a liquidity gush from where we moved to a safety net, where from liquidity we moved to gold, which is your safety. For a brief period, we also went to the risk of trade onto bonds. And then for the risk on trade to work, do you think that the equities and commodities will start playing out much stronger as we move from liquidity to safety, then to risk off and to risk on? So do you think that this will keep on continuing without actually any relevance to the EPS growth, and the P expansion theory will become more stronger?
It's a lovely question, Amit. So I'll tell you what I do personally. Okay. I have good advisors like yourself who tell me what needs to be done, and I try and listen to them. But more generically, I think it goes back to what you always preach, which is asset allocation, right? The happiest investor in this year probably is the person who didn't have to change his portfolio between January and now, right? If you have your asset allocation across debt, equity, commodities, gold, foreign currency in the right, proportions, you're okay through all the stuff that you've seen, right? Few things which I learned in my trading career. One is, of course, the power of compounding, which we all know. Second is the power of diversification. Now, some of us, for instance, if you're a promoter, you're obviously completely concentrated on your business. But for most of us who are managing a wealth, we don't need to concentrate on one business, right? So there, the power of diversification is immense. Now, equity markets, personally, I'm not happy with at all. And the reason for that is, I think the valuations are crazy at this point in time. It's essentially a lot of money which has come in and pushed the valuations up for all the reasons that we discussed, including there is no alternative on a tax adjusted basis, or kya karoge, 4% post-tax on fixed income, what do you do with that? So all of those issues. But, markets can remain, as they say, keep saying, markets can remain, absolutely out of whack for longer than you can remain solvent. So you can never get a top or get a bottom, right? So all you can do is put an allocation, asset allocation, and then live with it. Again, the quasi, I'm not a trained economist, but the quasi economist in my heart tells me the valuations are not right, that eventually corrections have to happen. The trader in my heart says, boss, go with the flow. You cannot fight the flow, right? So I average out by saying, do an asset allocation and forget about it.
Okay, sir, do you think monetary policy is enough to stimulate growth?
No.
Do you think that is the only thing? Because we have been artificially keeping rates low, and that might lead to a risk on trade. So fiscal deficit moving on. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's a great question again. So look, what I discussed earlier, let's not think of fiscal policy, monetary policy, etc. separately. What is the intent? The intent is to create money and put it in people's hands, right? Monetary policy is useful if rates are brought down and therefore credit starts to grow, which means banks start to lend. Because funnily, when banks lend, they create money. When they give you a loan, they're crediting your account. They've created money, right? And you have money in your hands for you to spend, right? So monetary policy is useful if it is creating money and therefore stoking demand, right? At this point in time, low interest rate is not creating credit. There is no lending happening at all. With all this liquidity, all this low rates, 5.5% is the credit growth. There is no credit growth happening at all because banks don't want to lend. The good guys don't want to borrow. The guys who want to borrow are the people who are bad, who don't have good, who have stresses, right? So there is a genuine problem. So monetary policy cannot create money by itself right now. Government fiscal policy can create money because they can spend, they can put it in your hand, my hand, hopefully my hand, and then I can spend, and then we can create, economic activity around us. So the ability of fiscal policy and monetary policy put together to create money is very, very high. It can be created. But as I was saying, it's not enough to create money. It's an important part of growth. You have to create money to create growth. But along with that money that you create, you have to create domestic output as well. We keep thinking we are creating domestic output because after all, our capacity utilization is so low. Kidhar hai? Factory ka matlab sab band hai. So when we have demand, therefore capacity utilization should go up. But historically, every time demand goes up, our net imports of goods and services goes up, which means we are not producing enough for ourselves. So we start exporting jobs and importing goods and services. That US does for the last 100 years. As an emerging market, we can't afford to do that. So for us, it's yes, creation of money through monetary and fiscal policy is an important component. Beyond that, creation of output and jobs is even more important. The ideal cycle is you create money, it creates demand, that spurs output. Because of output and supply, jobs are created. That creates more money and that creates savings, more investments, more output. And then it becomes a nice cycle which goes on forever.
Yeah.
China did that. China money growth has been consistently 15% per annum for the last 30 years. They've created money without inflation, without a currency crisis. Why? Because they created so much of output, not just enough for their own domestic demand, but they became the factory of the world. we are not even able to meet our own demand, let alone net export. And that is the crux. It's the biggest crux is not fiscal and monetary policy. That is easy. That is easy to create. The crux is how do you create jobs and output?
Sir, why do you think, India's inflation has been relatively higher than the world at all points of time? So is it a supply side constraint, supply side inflation, which has been the problem, or is it the import of commodities like oil and other stuff, electronics? Why is the inflation always high in India compared to the global economy?
It's a great question, Yara. It's actually a very deep question. I'm going to give a very simple answer. It's not bad to have a higher inflation. Remember, countries like Japan and US now, and you heard the Fed last week, in fact, this week, they're crying and saying, "Mujhe inflation do." Abe, who's just resigned or just moved on as the Prime Minister of Japan, right? So Abenomics. His slogan for getting votes was, "Tum mujhe vote do, main tumhe inflation dunga." Right? He was promising that he will bring inflation into the country. So those countries are hungry for inflation. Okay, having inflation is not a bad thing. It is a sign of growth. Inflation will come when the amount of money in people's hands is going up, and therefore they're able to spend. And you can have good inflation also. For instance, right now, if you're buying very basic food stuff, if you get more money in your hands and you're feeling good about the future, you start buying higher value protein and processed food, etc. So you can get good inflation as well. And it's important for India to have that. Okay. Right now, why you have inflation is a couple of reasons. It's in fact very funny. If you look at wholesale price inflation, it's almost zero, right? All the inflation is coming in CPI, which is the consumer price inflation. And the reason for that is multifold. One is there are supply and logistics problem. Okay. Goods are not, because of the lockdown, etc., goods are not moving up and down, especially imported goods. They're not moving smoothly. Okay. So there's a problem there. There is another supply problem, which is very, very dangerous. A lot of MSMEs are closing down. And because they're closing down, suppliers are no longer there. You have to change your suppliers and you're having to pay higher prices to get fresh goods, right? And that's a dangerous, dangerous situation. Your supply is getting destroyed, right? Capacity is getting destroyed. Third, taxes have gone up, right? So oil prices have gone up, taxes have gone up. And by the way, that's not over. We know telecom tariffs have to go up. We know power tariffs have to go up. We know there is a fiscal deficit, other tariff has to go up. So that will keep coming, right? Fourth, what I mentioned to you, money has gone to rural hands. That's a great thing. Why is it that all your FMCG customers or FMCG corporates are doing well? Because rural hands are buying. Even two-wheelers, autos, etc., sales in rural areas are doing well. Look at tractor sales. Look at all FMCG products in rural areas, right? They're doing well. Money is there in rural hands. Okay, it is genuinely looking good out there. So all this put together, so terms of trade moving to the rural sector, all the other issues which I mentioned to you, inflation can become a problem going forward as well.
Okay, Pallav, Jarak bhai, anybody?
I have one question. So you mentioned about inflation coming back a year later. Isn't that good for growth, sir? So more inflation, more money the corporates make, and more taxes the government gets. So isn't that good, sir, in a way?
So the way I'd like to see it, Pallav, is the following, right? I keep thinking of it as money supply and what happens with money supply, right? So when money is created and when money changes hand, then economic activity ensues. So when I buy something from you, then GDP is created, right? So you are the supplier, I'm the buyer, so GDP is created. Now, if too much of money is there and going around, you have volume of goods being produced and the price of goods being produced. That's the total GDP, right? That's the total GDP. Now, if your supply is not going up, then all this money activity translates into higher prices. So it is a sign that you're not producing enough. Or it is a sign that you're starting to import a lot more, right? So some inflation is good. It means there is economic activity happening. It means there is money coming in people's hands. We are all increasing our expenses. Great. So that's good. But too much of inflation can also be a sign that we are not producing enough. And unfortunately, between the period 2009 to 2013, when our inflation was consistently about 10% CPI inflation, that was a sign that we didn't have enough supply, which is a shame for a country like ours. We are so underemployed as a population. How can you say we're not able to create supply? It's just a wasteful use of our biggest resource, our people, right?
So what's your...
Sir, will we get a...
Amit bhai, please carry on.
No, Pallav, please complete.
So yeah,
There's a
what's your
lag,
view
so
on-
I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, MPC committee's guidance of 4 to 6%, 4% plus minus 2% of inflation targeting. So what happens? Suppose we have a 10% inflation, as you say, next year, sometime this year, this time next year. What happens to the entire monetary policy committee's mandate?
So I hope and pray we don't get 10% inflation. We can do without it. Thank you. I'm not seeing 10% inflation. I don't think 10% inflation comes. But anyway, so look, our monetary policy framework has a problem. Okay, it is too simplistic. It assumes that you can use a repo rate to control inflation almost like a linear, lever lagaya and then niche upar niche kiya. That is complete nonsense. Okay. So very simple funda. How is interest rate supposed to control inflation? As you hike interest rates, the cost of borrowing money goes up. So as the cost of borrowing money goes up, people borrow less. If people borrow less, they spend less. If you spend less, aggregate demand comes down. If aggregate demand comes down, prices come down. That's the way it's supposed to work. Sounds very logical in a good country like US, which is a borrow to spend economy. India is not a borrow to spend economy. Our household debt is just 11% of GDP. Our non-household debt is 55% of GDP. We are a borrow to produce economy. We borrow not to consume, we borrow to produce. For working capital, for investments, for creating supplies. So when you hike interest rates in India, we are not even sure, because cost is interest is an input cost into production, or are you bringing down demand? So there is all the research which has happened so far into this MPC framework. I've seen one by the Goldman Sachs, Pachi Mishra earlier. She shows that higher interest rates increases inflation, everything else being constant. So, the entire premise of inflation in interest, in MPC inflation is kind of skewed right now. Good news, because it's flexible inflation targeting, RBI manages it reasonably well, right? So technically right now, the last MPC which happened when it happened in July, right? We should have been thinking about hiking interest rates because inflation was above the 6% band. Instead, the debate was, will they cut or not, right? There was no question of hiking at all. So the MPC is, sensible enough to look at the real situation and not go with a simple basic formula. So I wouldn't worry about this 2% to 6% band too much. I think people are sensible. But yeah, I mean, the good part of this mandate is it gives some kind of stability. It at least the external world, it tells you that we are following by very good people. We'll not do any silly things. So at least that reputation-wise, it's good.
Amit bhai.
Sir,
A couple of questions on the.
can I?
Yeah, Janaka. Go ahead.
The whole world has been printing a lot of currency, and we have refrained from doing it. And I'm assuming that is the last arrow in his quiver. But do you have any thoughts on why we have not gone that route at all?
So great question. Actually, to some extent, we are going down that path, even though it's not enough, arguably. As I mentioned, the money supply has gone up by over 12.5% year on year. So even though our GDP has contracted by 25% in the first quarter, 24%, our money supply actually has gone up quite a bit. Okay, and then what is money supply? It's deposits and it's currency in circulation. All put together, it's gone up. So we have printed money. We have created money. Okay. Question is, should we create more money? Now, here is the real challenge, right? If you're creating money as a form of stimulus, that you're trying to get demand to go up so that some economic activity happens, unfortunately, at a time when there is a pandemic, putting money in people's hands is useless. If I get money today, I will go and keep it in the savings account. I'll do nothing with it. Or maybe I'll put it in the equity markets, God help me. Or kya karunga, So at the moment, money will not create consumption or demand because there is a pandemic. I can't go and spend. I would love to spend, but I can't go and spend. Right? Where money might be useful, which is what I am pushing for, is as relief. Okay, give relief to businesses. SMEs are in trouble, boss. Kuch karo. I mean, you've given money to people, but give money to businesses also here. And there are sectors which are dying. You can't let them die, right? And things like interest subvention, interest maaf kar do for 6 months, that actually works. So for instance, I'll give you a simple math. total MSME loans is about 20 lakh crores. Let's assume their interest rate is 12%. So 2.4 lakh crores is the annual interest cost. 6 months interest maaf kar do. That's 1.2 lakh crores. 0.6% of GDP. Kuch nahi hoga usse. I mean, it will not hit your fiscal वैसे भी बुरा हाल है. 0.6% से कुछ नहीं होगा. Okay? Give that relief. It's a huge relief to an MSME if he or she doesn't have to pay interest for that 6-month period. Right? So relief, printing money is absolutely, I think, required at this point in time. Beyond that, let's say pandemic is behind us. Okay, God willing, it will happen soon. That time, yes, printing money will be useful to try and push up consumption and demand. But I go back to my point, it's not enough for us to create demand. We have to also ensure supply and jobs are created alongside. And that is the critical part. Why can US get away with it? US gets away with it because they print dollars, which the whole world wants. Their biggest export is dollars. Unfortunately, we cannot export rupees. Nobody wants our rupees besides the people in Nepal. So, so we have our constraints. Our biggest, yes, we have to create demand, whether it is fiscal spending or credit or whatever it is, we have to create demand. But we have to follow it up with output as well. And don't take output for granted. It could very well happen that the demand we create creates inflation, not enough supply, or creates imports. We have done this in the past. We've asked for it, 2008 crisis ke baad, we did this. अरे पैसे दो तो फिस्कल पैकेज आया, क्रेडिट आया, पीपीपी आया, टेलीफोन बैंकिंग हुआ, सब कुछ हुआ, and all that money did not create output, right? So we have to create output along. If we can do that, create as much money as you want, no problem.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sir, what's your asset allocation today, Professor? That's a question in the chat box. What's your asset allocation today?
Yeah, I follow a very simple asset allocation. So, by the way, I also invest some money in overseas markets because I have, as I mentioned, I have 2 expensive kids. So I have invested via the LRS route, etc. Very, very simple terms. It's about 30% in debt. It's about 30% in equity. It's about, I'm guessing about 15% in real estate, and the balance is in liquid and stuff like that. So it's a very defensive
no
kind
gold.
of. No, there's some gold, but chunnu munnu. I mean, those RBI gold bonds or whatever. So that I've got some of that. My wife's gold I can't count because she'll not let me touch it anyway. So yeah. So broadly that, and as I mentioned, this 100% is some of it. Let's say about 15% or so is in overseas markets as well. So, but yeah. Please don't follow my. I'm very bad at personal investing. I follow a very passive strategy of just keeping the asset allocation. So I'm one of those guys who didn't have to change the asset allocation much through the course of the year. I've just left it as it is. I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing, but it felt good. It was kuch nahi karna pada.
Maybe you didn't get time to check your portfolio during these seminars over the last 5 months. So that might be one reason you didn't change.
So between March and April, I stopped looking because it didn't help to look at the portfolio at the time.
Right. Amit, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question. So I've picked up a few things which you said, and I would just like to share with you. You said output gap, employment policy changes, deleveraging, earnings growth, and credit offtake. These are 6 main points which you cover. Now, is it possible to tell us from where it will start and where it will end? Will it start with deleveraging, leading to earnings growth, and then leading to credit offtake, and then output gap and employment and policy changes? How will it work? Like, what is the critical path, I think, on which you will place these 5-6 things which you spoke about?
It's like a PERT CPM chart, right? Trying to
yeah.
So I'm guessing a few things have to happen in parallel. See, credit offtake will not happen now. It's very, very tough because yes, there are some very good banks who are capable of lending, but by and large, the overall system is not in a good shape to lend. Right? So the cleanup of the banking system has to start now. And
deleveraging, you mean?
I'm sorry?
The deleveraging part will happen first.
Deleveraging. So, whether it is creation of a bad bank, whether it is TARP, whether it is bank, reforms. Banking reforms, by the way, is not just consolidation. It's not just, privatizing Bank of Maharashtra or whatever. It is full-fledged things like PJ Nayak committee, recommendations. So banking reforms, governance reforms, market reforms, that will take time. It will not happen overnight. It will take 6 months to 1 year to get it done. Okay, so it will take a year for the system to become healthy enough to start lending in a big way. Okay, so that's one thing which will happen in parallel. Cleaning up of sectors like power, telecom, real estate can also start now. Again, it will take time. These are all deep issues. It will not be overnight. It will take maybe a year, maybe 2 years to get it cleaned up in a proper fashion. But of course, you can start right now. Where you can actually get some activity going is actually on the third part, which is investments. Now, it sounds very crazy when your capacity utilization is so low. Where will you get new investments from? Who the hell is investing right now? But that's where the beauty lies. If you're 1.35 billion people looking to consume stuff. So if Apple wants to sell in India, we tell Apple, boss, in 5 years' time, everything that you sell to us has to be made in India. Okay, then they have to start creating that supply chain in India, including for chips, including not just assembly, everything. Put the whole damn thing in India. Okay. Likewise, if you're going to buy planes from Boeing or from Airbus, we tell them, boss, everything we buy, you make here. Okay, so you bring that. So because we have a huge consumer market, unlike Vietnam and Bangladesh, who are really small, we have a huge consumer market. So we can tell them, boss, anything you want to sell, please make here. And we give you 5 years to do it. Okay, so that part of getting the supply chains from overseas, at least for make for India, if not for, because it's a very funny world right now with all this geopolitics, maybe we can't export too much right now, but at least for our own consumption, whatever you're saying to us, make it here. Okay. And then I'm hoping as things start, even the supply chains moving out of China, some of them might come to India. Anyway, China also wants to get out of low level manufacturing, etc. So some things can come to India. So in terms of investments, especially make for India and maybe a part of Make in India as well, I think that can start right away. And there is I speak to a lot of global investors in part of Observatory Group. There is so much goodwill for India. It's incredible. So when I tell them ki boss thoda bura hal hai, they tell me, no, you're being too negative. Actually, India's all fine. Look at South Africa, look at Brazil, look at Turkey, look at Russia. You're much better than all that, which is true. And they also tell me you're missing the wood for the trees. You guys are in a better shape. I'm very happy to hear that. So there's a lot of goodwill. If we get a few things right, money will come in. They will put in money. They're not feeling confident enough. Every time they see the story of Vodafone, every time they see a Supreme Court's in action, I hope I don't go to jail, but they start to get worried. Can I really put money out here? Right? So that third part, I think we can definitely can be the kickstart with some government spending as well. If governments, I'm supposed to be a fiscal hawk. I've always shouted in my life, ki fiscal, kam karo, don't spend so much, because it's all going into revenue expenditure. But if you're spending money into infrastructure, particularly what I mentioned, healthcare, education, nutrition, and into things like deep sea port, roads, etc. Karna hai, please karo, koi tension nahi hai. If you're putting in investments, which will get in investments, please do it. No problem.
Thank you.
Sir, the Fed has been pumping money for so long. After 2008, they only have probably a reservoir which has a tap which is open. If they want to close that or probably take that water and put back in the reservoir, will it happen in an orderly fashion, or it will disrupt probably the world market for this? That was question number one. And a lot of NRI clients on this webinar today, sir, they are asking what to do with money, what they have. Should they take it to India or probably invest it overseas?
So I'll take the second part first. Please bring money to India. We need the money. Leke aiye, please. No, but jokes apart, look, you will get investment opportunities in India at a time when interest rates are as low as they are globally, at a time when investment opportunities are as low as they are globally. You will get investment opportunities in India. Keep the powder dry, keep the faith. But yeah, I mean, choose the right partner, choose the right investment opportunity, all that you have to do, and probably take the right advice from the right people. On the first part, on the Fed unwinding, etc., boss, it's unthinkable. We saw a glimpse of what could happen in May 2013. If you remember, Bernanke spoke about Fed tapering, right? And then there was a taper tantrum which followed, which impacted all emerging markets, especially the fragile five. Unfortunately, India was part of that in a big way, right? So there is no doubt that global liquidity from global central banks has pumped up a lot of assets. If there is a withdrawal of that money, there will be a huge repercussion. The good news is, if you saw the Fed, meeting which happened this week, they are not looking at a recovery in any time soon. In fact, they're saying they're not in the mood at all. So 2023 tak, matlab, please, party is a signal, right? The party continues till then. The punch bowl will not be taken away, and even beyond that, we'll be very, very thoughtful. So, look, here is the point. I think there is a window of opportunity for us in India because of this global stimulus, because everybody's in the same boat. Hopefully, we will get by. We have to get our act together, though. You know, and my bottom line is, don't take things for granted. Yes, people don't like China. They want to move supply chains out of China, but they will not come and fall in our lap. No, don't assume that this is going to come automatically. It will take a lot of hard work, that ease of doing investments, etc. So a lot of hard work is required. I'm guessing in the next 4-5 years, there's no reason why we can't start to recover our economy in such a way that even if the Fed starts to unwind, we'll be fine. See, at a time when the global population is aging and investment opportunities are dropping, India is going to be like a oasis of investment opportunities and of growth and of an aspirational population. I have worked in 12 countries. I can tell you, I've not seen an aspirational population anywhere like ours. Okay, so we have a lot of positive to pull us through. We have to get our act together. We can't take it for granted.
Paresh?
Nothing from my side, Amit. I think questions got covered in the previous questions. Thank you.
Okay, Pallav, you want to take some from the Q&A, then we can head for a close.
Yeah, one of the questions, I'll just combine a couple of questions, was what's your view on the privatization? You said that that's not the golden arrow, that privatization of PSU banks will actually solve problems. So apart from everything else, so how do you see this entire move of the government to actually consolidate the banks, A, privatize the banks, B, and what if cutting taxes by such a huge margin is not actually able to stimulate growth, then what will actually? This is one of the couple of questions.
Okay. Privatization is a controversial topic. We can have a discussion on it for a whole hour on whether to privatize banks or other entities or not. I said privatization of small banks, 3-4 banks is not neither here nor there. I mean, it doesn't move the needle. Consolidation is good reform. In fact, I think the finance minister is on record saying she wants to see only 4 large banks in the country. It's a good reform, but I'm saying it's not the critical reform today. The critical reform is solution to the NPAs. The critical reform is how do you ensure the cycle of creation of NPAs, lend, extend, pretend stops. Critical reform is how do we get our banks in a position to start lending again, right? So that is not achieved by consolidation. Consolidation is a minor reform compared to all of that, which is why I'm saying things like actually creating a bad bank, undertaking PJ Nayak reforms, etc. Those are far more important reforms at this point in time than privatization or consolidation. By the way, PJ Nayak's committee also talks about privatization. Okay, you know what it says? It doesn't say privatization per se. It says, look at the Singapore model. DBS is owned by Government of Singapore, but not directly. It's owned via Temasek, which is a sovereign wealth fund, which means the Government of Singapore does not get involved in day-to-day operations of DBS. Okay. Now, of course, if there is a calamity, Government of Singapore will step in and use DBS. No questions asked. But day-to-day operations, tum mudra banking karo, tum phone banking karo, tum falana banking karo, that doesn't happen. Okay, you are left with professional. Mr. Rajneesh Kumar, who's retiring soon, he earns 31 lakh rupees in a year for a 40 lakh crore balance sheet. I mean, what joke is this here? Right? So, I mean, you're not allowed to hire and fire. You're not allowed to give incentives. You're not held accountable. Somebody in DFS, some babu is telling you what to do. Ye kya mazak hai ye? So, you know, PJ Nayak is more about getting a distance between Delhi and banking. But it also says eventually try and privatize. I mean, but that's a very controversial topic. On the second part, what is the second part again? Just remind me. It was on
taxes, cutting off corporate taxes.
See,
or GST maybe.
There is no, or GST maybe. Corporate taxes was done, right? So 20th September last year, they cut corporate taxes in a big way. It's a great reform, no questions asked. For getting in fresh investments, no questions asked. It's a very good reform. But here is the deal. There is no one magic wand ki ye kar diya, sab kuch theek ho gaya. Okay, China became China not by switching on one switch. It took them 3 decades of making mistakes, correcting, changing, vagara, vagara. It's a long process. And you don't start declaring victory with one switch being on, right? There are multiple things you have to do. I think, and by the way, I think we are doing it now. I think Niti Aayog has taken on the ownership of trying to get some of the large investors to come into India. And many of you have invested in China, I'm sure, or in Korea, other places. You get a red carpet welcome when you're going there. Yeah. I've been a banker, so when I accompany some of my clients to places like China, you're taken care like a god. The province tells you we will shower tax, holiday for you for so many years. Land is here. Here is one window for you to do everything. When are you coming? Everything. They're just welcoming you for everything. That approach is required here. It can be done. No reason why we can't do it. But it requires a lot of work. So, as I mentioned, besides taxes, things like land acquisition, things like labor laws, things like our judicial processes, contract enforcement, policy certainty. These are issues. And people like Nilesh Shah and Manish Sabharwal, all these guys have written and spoken a lot about what needs to be done on all these issues. So there are lots of good ideas there which need to be done over a period of time. It can happen, but it will take time. Don't take it for granted. On GST, look, it's unfortunately a tough time to cut GST right now when your fiscal deficit is the way it is, right? But clearly that implementation can be improved, right? It's still very messy in many, many ways. It's still creating a lot of problems. I'm sure we'll get there. It's a great reform. Over a period of time, it should hopefully settle down, but a long way to go even now.
So how much time do you have?
I think somebody has been hearing you talk, sir. So Maharishi panel has already submitted his recommendation on removal of interest on the moratorium part, and the cost to sovereign is 15 to 20,000 crores, and the government is expected to actually submit this recommendation to the Supreme Court on Monday in the next hearing, which is on.
I'm surprised it's only 15-20,000 crores.
Somebody is
So it's an interesting thing because it's only for those who have availed of moratorium. So
right.
Basically, all those who did not avail of moratorium should now go to the Supreme Court and say, "Boss, mera kya hua? For being a good boy and paying up, you're not giving me interest. The benefit of interest or interest." I think we should all do that.
Yeah. Dhruv sir, you had a question. You're on mute, sir.
I wanted to know, is there any, linkage between the spread between the US yield? US is the trendsetter for interest rates worldwide, but somehow India seems to be, the Indian interest rates are not sort of, historically we used to have a sort of a spread between the US and the GSEC, but any thoughts on that, or is it linked to basically the underlying inflation differential? And so coming to the overall, the Indian, one of the things that growth and the cost of capital, how we can, reduce the long-term cost of capital?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dhruv. Thanks for that. So look, it's a whole course by itself that we teach in campus on relation how our interest rates determine and what factors go into interest rates, which is a long-winded way of saying it's not a one answer. It's a complicated answer. But very quickly, US interest rates do dictate what happened to global interest rates, including rupee interest rates, and that's because we have a partially open capital account. So what tends to happen, Dhruv, is if US rates go too low. Okay, so let's say US rates go down to 0 and Indian interest rates are still at 6%. Then a lot of NRIs sitting in Singapore will start to take out money from the dollar deposits and start putting money in NRE deposits instead, where you earn tax-free rupees, right? Your coupon is anyway tax-free. So you get 7% or whatever tax-free, right? So all those inflows into rupee interest rate products start to bring down rupee interest rates. So there is a channel by which money will flow from one country to the other, from the low interest country to the high interest country. We call it, in the trading parlance, we call it a carry trade. So you go from the low interest currency to the high interest currency. It also works the reverse way. So if I'm a rupee borrower, if I need to borrow sitting in India, if my rupee interest rates are 10% and my dollar interest rates are 0%, I would start borrowing in dollars rather than borrowing in rupees. I'll take ECBs, etc. Right? I'm of course taking a large currency risk, but I'm assuming that the rupee will not depreciate by more than this interest rate differential. So there is a way in which interest rates of US drag down other country interest rates, including India. Rupee interest rates overnight is now at 3%. So the RBI repo rate is 4%, but actual repo rate in the market for bonds is at 3.1, 3.2%. So it's actually quite low. And it's at a historical low. I've never seen as a trader, I've never seen it at this low. So rupee rates have been dragged down. Now, question is, why is the 10-year bond yield at 6%? Okay, that's because there is an enormous amount of borrowing happening by the governments. Because they're running such large fiscal deficits, they are having to borrow money, and they typically like to borrow in the longer end. So that demand for money from the government, both central as well as state governments, is keeping the longer end high. RBI is pushing it down, by the way, by doing a lot of market operations. So they're doing open market purchases. They're doing operation twist, as they call it. They're doing LTROs. All of that brings down the longer end rates, and they've brought it down to 6%. If RBI had not been there, the interest rate would have been 7 to 8%, purely as a result of supply and demand, which is government trying to borrow, and all of us saying, "Mujhe agar borrow karna hai, to I'll give you only at this cost." Okay. So now, what is a fair interest rate is your next question. I mean, if interest rates are at 8%, 9%, how the hell will I invest? Now, here is the first point problem, Dhruv. At the moment, nobody wants to invest because, it's a question of survival. You're not trying to invest, right?
Yeah.
So nobody is looking to borrow 10-year money other than the government of India and state governments, right? So that's the first point. There is no crowding out happening because interest rates are too high. Because even if you bring interest rates down to 4%, I can assure you nobody wants the money for 10 years and for setting up a project or whatever it is. Now, second point is, while we look at borrowers and investments, think of savers, right? Every market is a demand and supply market. The savers supply the funds, the borrowers demand the funds. Logically, the price should be where both of them agree without any interference. As I mentioned, this is unfortunately not a free market because the RBI has pressed the rates down by intervening. Savers are getting a very poor rate. The RBI's inflation survey shows that the inflation expectation is more than 10.5% 1 year down the road. It's in double digits. And savers are getting 4% for 1 year. So there is massive repression of rates happening. My mother, who by the way puts money in a public sector bank, she will never put money in a foreign bank or private bank. She's crying. And she's saying, all my money, I'm getting only 6%. What am I going to do, right, with it? And her perception of inflation is very, very high, right? So it is a fine balance between savers and borrowers. Ideally, the market should decide based on supply and demand. At the moment, the RBI is pushing it down already. So if anybody should be complaining, it should be the savers, not the borrowers. And because rates are so low, one of the reasons why money is going into equity markets, as I mentioned earlier, because I don't want to put money at 4%. I'd rather put money in the equity markets instead. It's a complicated subject. I mean, there are no right answers out here. Depending on what side you're on, I can give you 6 arguments in your favor.
Rupa ma'am, you had a question. You are on mute, ma'am. Rupa ma'am, you are on mute.
I'm sorry, I joined the panel a little late, but I basically wanted to know, there are questions on rupee dollar, saying that if rupee depreciates, so every client always wants to, because there's a lot of investors who have invested money now in the US in the last 1 year because US markets were doing well. And there is always a question saying that should be a long term because rupee dollar is depreciating, and what would happen then? So these are the questions, one of the questions where clients do ask us. So I think you have answered this, but I'm repeating that.
No problem. So I'll give you a trader answer first, and then I'll give you a economist answer. Then I'll tell you what I'm doing personally. So the trader answer is the following. Look, actually, the dollar itself has been weakening quite a bit globally, right? So there's something called the DXY. So look at against euro, for instance. So euro is now closer to 1.18. So it used to be 1.10 or so beginning of the year, right? So so euro has strengthened, dollar has weakened. Likewise, look at CNY. CNY is now 6.75. It's come down quite. It used to be well over 7 till recently. So dollar has weakened against most currencies in the world. okay, over the course of the year. And a lot of it is because of this huge pumping of dollars done by the Fed. By the way, the Fed now holds more US treasuries on its own books than all central banks of the world put together. It's the biggest holder of treasuries in the world. Okay. Anyway, so dollar itself is weakening, and therefore there is pressure on all other currencies, including on the rupee, to strengthen. Right. As I also mentioned, the flows this year are looking enormously positive for us. Our current account has become a surplus. Reliance Jio is going out of fashion. You know, everybody is coming and putting money into Reliance Jio. So FDI is looking good as well. God knows Reliance Retail might bring in money as well. So who knows? So and likewise, our FPI equity money is also looking good. So flows are looking very, very good. And therefore, it stands to reason that rupee should probably look to appreciate over a period of time, right? However, I'm worried about what could happen a year down the road, because our current account surplus is temporary. Eventually, when we start consuming, our current account will flip again, right? And more importantly, our terms of trade are not good for us. We anyway import too much. Our domestic industry is anyway suffering, not because of rupee, but because of other reasons. But the rupee adds to the problem. So purely from what I think RBI will do perspective, I would still think, while things will remain very calm and nice for the next maybe 6 months or so, 1, 2, 3 years down the road, I think it will kind of weaken. So my own trader path would be, if you want, you can stay long rupees for now, which means short dollars, but be ready to flip and go the other way at some stage. I would still play for the long term as a long dollar trader. As an economist, I can tell you it can go up or go down. I don't have no clue. And I'll tell you what I'm really doing. While I love trading a little bit and taking punts here and there, by and large, I keep myself 50% in dollars. What that means is, I mentioned earlier, I have a couple of kids to educate in the US. If the total fees and total cost for them is $100, at any point of time, I keep $50 in dollars. So I try and, so it goes back to the asset allocation story. Don't try to second guess what the hell is going to happen. The world is extremely uncertain. We can all have views. We will only remember the views that were right. We will all forget the views that were wrong. And then, we will keep doing this for cows come home. It's a coin toss. End of the day, markets are a coin toss most of the time. Okay. So what that means is, for me, I try and keep 50% in dollars. Every time dollar rupee goes up, I say, thank God I've at least got 50% in dollars. Every time dollar rupee goes down, I say, thank God I've only done 50%. I have more to go. And that's kind of a asset allocation, peace of mind solution that I find.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, one last, I'll take one more question, and Amit bhai, thereafter you can do the close. There's a question from Ashish Pimple. He's asking, sir, next 3 years, if you were to stick your neck out and make a choice between a combination of credit risk funds, equities, gilt and gold, how do you choose? What do you choose, and how do you want to make the combinations?
This is, I've already given the answer of what my portfolio looks like currently, which is like probably as equal as you can get across all of this.
But any view on credit risk funds per se? So that is why actually I specifically asked this question.
It's not that bad now, yeah. So look, it's gone through a lot of pain in March and April, etc. Few things have happened. Of course, it depends on the scheme and all of that. So let's keep those caveats aside. I think funds have become a lot more careful now. They're being very, very careful about the credit choices that they make. Don't go for legacy funds, go for new funds, etc., where the credit choices are good. Especially if you're putting money into good sectors, etc., which are growing right now, I don't think it's a problem. So I don't think credit funds is a bad word anymore, as it was, let's say, in February or March when things are looking really bad. I think things have improved. So there will still be, and the good news is you'll probably get a good price in credit funds, because people are so scared of credit funds right now that, there's a natural aversion out there. Disclosure, I don't have too much money in credit funds, but I don't think it's a bad time to look at credit funds.
Amit bhai, all yours. Yes, Dhruv sir.
Can I ask you one thing is, in case of fixed income, I mean, normally asset allocation, people look between debt and equity or in terms of asset classes. But in case of fixed income, where interest rates can be quite volatile, very difficult for normal individual, as you said, to really, like say the currency or even the interest rate movements, it's so difficult to predict. And if you're a long-term investor into fixed income, would it be prudent that even in fixed income one does asset allocation and the approach And if we look at the risk in fixed income, one is a liquidity risk, one is an interest rate risk, and third is the credit risk. So if one is to create a portfolio, one is a very liquid portfolio. We are very much at the short end in AAA. Second is you take an interest rate risk, some portion on the long end. And third is you take some extent of a credit risk portfolio. So either you divide, say, in 3 ways or in 4 ways in terms of you could have a medium term. So, if one is to follow an asset allocation, even in fixed income, I mean, over these years, one realizes that, generally one tends to sway. Either you become very bullish on duration, or at times you've seen people become very bullish on credit. So how would...
Great question, yeah. It's a great question. So I'll tell you, again, what I do personally. On my fixed income portfolio, I've for many years now, and I have a good advisor, thankfully, I've always erred on the side of being very risk averse. So I've not gone into credit funds. Even FMPs, I make sure the schemes don't have funny papers in them, in the past at least. And likewise, I've gone into gilt funds, which not many people go into. In some cases, I found that the duration is reasonably good. And the reason I've done that is I've preferred to take risk in equities rather than in credit. I've said that if I have to go down the path of risk, might as well go into equities than into credit, particularly given the illiquidity in credit markets, etc. Now, the reason I said, credit markets are not bad right now. By the way, if you look at credit markets right now, you have multiple 3 tiers. Okay, you have some which are almost at sovereign rates. So if you look at the really high quality credits, the CPs for them, for instance, they are almost at T-bill rates, or somewhere around T-bill rates. So there is no credit spread at all. Okay, then you have a whole bunch in the middle, which is like 3-4% higher than that. Okay, and people are not saying they're going to collapse, but there is a lot of fear about kya hoga asset quality. A lot of them are NBFCs. A lot of questions there. Some of them are even going at double digits. Okay, so the yields are going at double digit even now. Okay, then there's a third category who cannot raise money at all. Even for whatever love of money, you're not getting any funds. Now, the opportunities are probably in the middle space. Okay, I would not touch the long end with a barge pole. You will get people offering you some of those credits. Don't touch them with a barge pole. In the middle space where there are trades happening, there's probably some bad news to come, but it looks like it's a rich pricing. That might not be at bad space. The high quality space, you might as well buy a state government bond. In fact, some state government bonds offer better yields than a AAA corporate, right? So, it's almost like sovereign going into state government. So I think in the middle space is where there is a opportunity right now. Should you do an asset allocation across fixed income, which is your larger question? I think you should, Dhruv, but I don't do it personally. I have always veered towards being extremely safe because you don't want too much of headaches here. Sitting and thinking about, if you want risk, might as well go into equity.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Pallav, can I close?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Anand Narayan. I think it's 5:45. You have given us 1 hour 45 minutes, and you started with a true picture of what the economy is, and then you said that it will be a happy ending. So sunsets are actually proof that no matter what happens, every day can end beautifully. So thank you for that, Professor Anand Narayan. And Pallav, I want to say that when you say Anand, it means endless. And when you say Narayan, it means the eternal truth. So a guy who is talking the truth about the economy, it has to be an endless talk. So sir, we would like you to come back whenever time permits to speak to a larger audience with Sapient. But really thank you from all members of Sapient as well as our customers. I think you did justice to all the questions as well. And we hope that you stay safe and we get you back on Sapient Conversations live, physically on a larger stage with all our clients. Thank you very much.
God willing, it will happen soon. And thank you again, Amit, Pallav, everybody, Sapient family, and all of you. Stay safe and stay good. Hope to catch up soon, very soon. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Cheers.